Well, we've got a mystery to solve in this video, and the mystery is related to the Scottish Conservative Party. And I'm joined by Ewan Morris, our North East chairman, and we're going to try to work out what they're up to. So, Ewan, where do we start? What are they up to?
So the story starts back in January, whenever it was, whenever their Northeast MSP, Douglas Lumsden, submitted almost 1,000 questions to the Parliament, and this was almost half of all questions submitted by all 128 members in total. So it seems like a rather ridiculous thing. And some of the questions he asked were downright bonkers, kind of confusing as to what they related to. So there were questions about how much profit and loss on the Scottish government's beeswax, how many flags they owned from different countries, how many street lamps they owned on a specific section of the A90 north of Dundee. Kind of questions that would make your head spin. And the media jumped immediately onto it, and they thought, it must be AI. If he's submitting so many questions, it must be to do with, he's putting this through a chat GPT bot to try and generate them. And while I don't entirely share their view of it, I think there's something else going on. So there is a story that's come up quite recently which kind of cements this. There's something else going on. And it was that Russell Finlay announced that he had plans for a Scottish Doge run by the Scottish Conservatives, mimicking Elon Musk's Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, over in the US. And Elon Musk's Doge, relates to they've gone in and they've basically torn up multiple, instances of fraud, waste, and abuse. They shut down entire departments. They found people who were over 150 years old and various other things, and they've been able to action that and save the government millions. But yes, the issue here is that the cost for the Scottish Conservatives to do this could be anywhere from £80,000 to £150,000, and they've kindly asked the public to foot that bill by putting it through the public the parliamentary questions process.
So, how do you work out that cost?
So there was a report done by the Scottish Parliament way back in 2008 or 2009, which basically said that the cost of doing a parliamentary question roughly equates to about £98, so just under £100. So, using our, since 2008, obviously inflation has occurred and, the government spending has gone out of control. So it's probably much higher. But on the lowest end, we're saying basically £100 times 1,000 questions. You're talking £90,000-100,000 roughly. Or on the higher end, if you apply inflation to that, you're talking about £150,000.
And is this the system that MSPs are supposed to use to gather this sort of information?
Well, this system exists to hold the government to account, so kind of, but the issue here is the amount of spurious requests which are duplicated, requests which are to the wrong department. So for things like asking, Transport Scotland various facts about roads like the A90, because Douglas Lumsden loves asking about the A90, for example. But asking things like, how many LED bulbs have been installed on this? How, what's the breakdown between LED and halogen? How many overpasses are there? How much maintenance is there? How much does it cost to install cat's eyes? Things like that. These questions should go directly to Transport Scotland. They have their own freedom of information process, and they have their own processes. They've probably already revealed this information. It's probably public knowledge. Same with the NHS facts he asked for. A lot of these can be done by directly going to the NHS. But the issue I see is that you can't use your Parliament staff and your Parliament time to ask questions to the NHS and Transport Scotland. You can only ask Parliament questions with your kind of staff time. So,
okay, well, let's have a look at some of these bizarre questions you've been saying about.
Right, so here is the data. Basically, I've gone on to the Scottish Parliament website and I've done an extraction from their API interface, which basically let me go in and take a copy of all the questions that every MSP has submitted. So that's this big list here from all the MSPs, and I was able to narrow it down and extract some of Douglas Lumsden's requests. So here are 5 questions he asked about bees. So he asked the corporate body if they could verify that the beeswax used on the seal of Scotland comes from the parliamentary bees and whether it pays for the wax to the beekeeper. So basically the government has some bees on site at the Parliament, I gather, and they must use their beeswax to stamp letters or something. So he's asked basically to verify that and how much it's costing. And then he asked them how many visits the beekeeper has made to the Parliament in the last 5 years, which I think is a ridiculous question because he's obviously like an employee. So it'd be very hard to get this information. It seems very spurious and very kind of ridiculous. He also asked, what's the notice period for the beekeeper to visit the Parliament in the last 5 years? And I think that's also ridiculous to ask because, well, if he's an employee, he'd be expected in all the time. You couldn't give notice. Plus,
Yeah, I mean, that's a question where you just think, what possible interest, genuine interest, could anyone have in wanting to know how many days' notice are given before the Scottish Parliament beekeeper? I mean, that's just total nonsense. There's no conceivable useful purpose for that information.
Yes, and keep in mind this costs a minimum of £100 because, each of these requests. And yes, we can argue about whether it's right that there is a beekeeper in the Parliament and the Parliament keeps bees, but that's not what these questions are asking. These questions are completely different. So there's a question of how many jars of honey were produced from the bees in the last 5 years, and also asked what was the average profit and loss per jar sold in the Scottish Parliament shop. So each of these questions, probably £200. I bet you the cost of these questions is probably more than they made on beeswax and bee jars of honey anyways. So yes. Yeah. So he's asked about 8 questions about pagers, ranging on a heap of issues like basically maintenance, operation of them, and their impact in emergency situations. Multiple times he's mentioned about, what's the alternatives? Have they been researched? And, considering that this is 8 of these, so you're talking between almost £800 and £1,000 to answer these questions. But anyways, let's move on to another area he'd love to ask about, which was flags. So he asked about how many flagpoles they have broken down by height and the maintenance costs for the last 15 years. It's bonkers. And then obviously how many flags they own, how many national flags they've bought, cost to maintain them, how many have gone missing, how many flags have been purchased by the corporate body rather than the government, total cost of maintaining flags, how many flagpoles the corporate body owns and maintained in the last 15 years, how many flags the corporate body owns. I mean, it's the same as the last 5 questions he's asked. How many flags do you own? And then also another one about how many flags it's owned that have gone missing or been damaged.
I mean, it's bizarre as that. I mean, it's either he's using AI that's not very intelligent, but if he's trying to gather information, as we believe, in order to talk about government inefficiencies, it's just so incompetent. It's so unfocused and repetitive. It's laughable almost. Anyway, let's carry on. So that's flags. What else have we got?
So the next thing he asked about was the A90. Now, he asked about the A90 a total of 60 times. I think it was almost 70 by the time I'd counted up ones that didn't mention it directly. But it's honestly like ludicrous. Some of the things he was asking was, obviously there's things about maintenance and junctions, and there was a few questions about the toll of Burness, which as a Northeast resident, I understand those questions, but there's things about cat's eyes. Let's see if I can find some of these more shocking examples. Street lamps, number of street lamps. And then there was ones about, how many street lamps have been replaced? What proportion is illuminated by street lamps? Any plans to extend it? Let's see if there's anything else that's quite kind of stands out a bit. The condition, how it's changed in the last 5 years. Any plans to upgrade? How many repairs? How many bridges and overpasses are there on the road? That's probably already public knowledge. It's probably already on
Google Maps and count them.
You could, or you could just get the public to pay for it by using your staff and and the parliamentary question system. So it's obviously cheaper for the Tories to have their staff go through and have the SNP answer the questions than do the research. So there's a heap of these questions which are duplicates. A lot of the same things. How's it going to meet future load-bearing requirements? Here's the go. What's the total electric cost for all the street lamps on this one road? Well, presumably that's going to be very hard to figure out exactly. You can give an estimate, but they don't keep a meter for every single lamp. How many are LED bulbs? Timelines for repairing a bridge damaged by Storm Babbitt. You know, how much has been spent on upgrading the street lamps? It's like everything's about street lamps, drainage, bridges. There's one about cat's eyes. To ask the government how much of cat's eyes have been inspected and tested on the sections north of Dundee and south of Dundee. I mean, why would you need a split of what, you know, inspections have been done north and south of Dundee, and then asking about cat's eyes and emergency telephone costs? And there's a lot of this whole, he wants it split between north of Dundee and south of Dundee, and then other trunk roads. It's, you know, it's like he's deliberately attempting to try and kind of frustrate people and waste time. It's, you know, why would you word it any other way?
Okay.
So here's a kind of breakdown of all the topics. We looked at a few topics in particular, like 59 A90 questions. He asked 74 questions about food standards Scotland, the questions about honey and beekeepers, 49 about NHS boards, which is like the questions he wants broken down by board, so statistics. 30 about net zero. How many questions did he ask about education? Well, he only asked 5 questions about education. So I think it's very clear where his priorities lie relating to these questions he was asking. He asked more questions about overpass bridges than he did about education. So that's quite shocking. So if we take a look at how much this has actually cost. So on the low end, we're talking about probably 88,000 at a minimum. And then on the high end, we're also talking about 130,000. And that doesn't mention extra staff costs. This could be much more. You know, it's these are kind of the lowest estimates that you could come up with. But 130k of public money on the high end is ridiculous for the kind of questions he's been asking.
Yeah. What was his record number of questions per day?
So his record number of questions was 902. Broken down by day, which you can do from the data, we can see that he actually submitted 300 questions in one day. He submitted 275 just a week later. So the majority of his questions were all submitted in big batches on these same days. You know, it could point towards, you know, I don't want to say for definite, but it kind of says, well, how does one submit 300 questions unless you're using some kind of aid or some kind of technology to assist? It's obviously speculation. We can't prove it, but that's kind of the idea behind it.
Yeah. I mean, I would say the really interesting thing with this is, I mean, we're pretty certain, aren't we, that what's going on here is the Scottish Conservatives are gathering data for their, you know, Department of Government Efficiency copy. That's what they're trying to do. But I just think, what an embarrassing admission for the Conservatives. And it's like them saying, we haven't been bothering checking about wasteful spending and government efficiency for the last however many decades, but because Elon Musk's doing it in America, we've suddenly realized maybe it'd be a good idea for us to do as well. For goodness sake, you're supposed to be the Conservative Party. I mean, that should just be your bread and butter, week in, week out job, to be pointing out waste from the Scottish government. So how humiliatingly embarrassing to admit there's something going on in a different country has prompted you to actually think about it yourself. I mean, that's really really embarrassing. But then the other thing is, you know, they're talking about tackling inefficiency, and then they go about it like this, which has been hugely wasteful. I mean, it's the height of hypocrisy. I mean, just before we wind up, just the family party in our policies, which we compiled at zero cost to the taxpayer. Let's clarify. We've got a lot about saving money and defunding organizations. You know, that's been happening in America, defunding organizations left, right, and center. I mean, here's our list of organizations to defund. Young Scots, Children and Young People's Commissioner, Equality Network, Transgender Scotland, Creative Scotland, Scottish Human Rights Commission, Equality and Human Rights Commission, Amnesty International, White Ribbon, Engender Crew, Alcohol Focus, Stonewall, Friends of the Earth, National Parents Forum, LGBT Health and Wellbeing, LGBT Youth Scotland, Obesity Action Scotland, Interfaith Scotland, One Scotland, Score Scotland, Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, Culture Republic, Scottish Lines of Regional Equality Councils, Semvo, Bemis, Steve Retson Project, Children in Scotland, Amina, Fast Forward, Starcatchers Together, and the Scottish Book Trust. Okay, how about that? So the family party have got that list together of organizations to defund from day one. And we didn't need to wait for Elon Musk to suggest to us, maybe it'd be a good idea to see if the government's wasting any money on anything. We've prepared our case on these things at no expense to the taxpayer. But the Conservatives swing into action decades late and just blunder their execution of it. I mean, it really is quite remarkable. Any closing shots?
No, nothing really. I think you've summed it up pretty well. The Conservatives have demonstrated that their government of efficiency is grossly inefficient. It's incredibly wasteful of taxpayer money. So can we really expect any kind of efficiency out of their fake version of this government efficiency department? I don't think so.
No. But frankly, it's an embarrassment to Scottish politics based on the Scottish Parliament, what's going on here. But Ewan, thank you very much for doing the research and getting to the bottom of this. And well, let's see if the Conservatives got anything to say in reply. We'll look forward to that. All right, thanks for watching.